guarding the perimeter, which looked very menacing. But an unseen ally had already helped Chekhov, and he didn't even think about it. He had already moved anti-tank persons to remove all these tanks, but there was no reason. None of the tanks were on. Even when the Germans decided, we have to get in there, they stepped into their tanks and weren't able to turn them on. Not because of the winter, because they had been heating them. Not because of the lack of gasoline, they had all that, but because of the rats that had been scared out from the city by the bombing that they had done. They went into the tanks and chewed through all the wires, rendering all the tanks useless. If it weren't for the rats, the Russians may have been killed and all of World War II may have ended differently. But because of the rats and because of their intuition to bite through twang wires, they saved the Russians. Which is when another Russian sniper was introduced. And his name, it is very complicated, so I have to look at it. Sorry. Volka. Now, Volka was the best sniper that has ever lived in human history. There's even a book about him called Notes of a Russian Sniper. You can read it. It's a very good book. Just to show you, this is what he looked at before his death. All these medals are from one battle. This man had 255 confirmed kills by the end. 40 of those kills came in one day. To give you an example, that's about 2 platoons worth of soldiers in one day. Again, he said that there was a group of 12, this is a story about him, there were a group of 12 soldiers and he only had 6 bullets. And he took them all down with 6. He had been a hunter in his hometown and had already practiced tons and tons. Now, he was able to take them all down because of his pure skill in the art of sniping. And it became an art because Stalin introduced a newspaper that was called Heroes of Stalingrad. And proudly on the front were snipers, all their names and all their confirmed kills, and he was at the top of that every time the paper aired. And it made more people want to become snipers. So at the beginning of the battle, there were only about 1,500. At the end of the battle, there were over 5,000 snipers. But right after Chekhov decided to enact his plan, and after the tanks had been beaten, he took back all the land that was once lost, effectively encircling the Germans, who were then left in 2 groups. They were in these 2 areas, here and here. The main German general, Paulus, was right here. He was right in the center of it. Also near an oil refinery area. Now remember I told you there was another whole city. Well, sometimes you have to clean out the river, and that was what they were doing. So an oil refinery that they all thought was empty, or the cleaning tank, was not. And one German bomb went the wrong way and exploded this whole area, turning it into a fire so bright that apparently 10 miles away from the city you could read a book. That's how bright the fire was. Now, I forgot to pass this one out. It's the female snipers, I'm sorry. Very awesome. Now the fires also helped the snipers because now they could work at nighttime. They did not have to wait till the day to start their rampages. And after that, over 100,000 Germans were sniped and killed in the span of a week. Near the end of this battle, in January of 1943, this whole German area had been reclaimed by the Russians. And the Russians had began to do something that no one else had thought of except for Chekhov. He wanted to not only break them as soldiers, but break their psyche. He planted air raid sirens and other types of speakers around. He encircled them and put them around the circle and constantly played propaganda saying, "Give up, you've already lost." He played this for a month, and he never attacked the Germans. And yet Germans' deaths rose. Not because of anything that they were doing. He told all his snipers to stop, but because of suicide rates. The Germans were committing suicide, and sometimes so far as to shoot themselves and their friends with the same bullet. Now, the Germans then bombed another building and created a runway. So they had one runway out. And then Hitler started supplying his Nazi brethren. The supplies came in every day, but the Russians let it happen because they knew there was no hope for them. They weren't going to get weapons, they only needed food because German soldiers started to die of not weapons, not suicide, but starvation. They started to starve to death. And the body count rose so exponentially they could no longer bury their dead because they had dug only a certain amount of holes and the ground was so hard from the snow and the ice, they could not even bury them. So they had to put them in buildings that then they burned to the ground, and apparently letting off the worst smell that's ever seen Russia. Now, the Russians saw what they were doing and decided to start airdropping their own things. And Chekhov said, I want you to only airdrop the essentials. The first crate that landed was a vodka. We know our priorities. Oh, yes. Vodka. Half the vodka was actually used for medical reasons because of the alcohol, and they no longer had pure alcohol. That's all they had is vodka. And the rest was drank by the soldiers. They were all happy. Now, I'm going to show you a picture of the square. This is all that was left of the square after the bombing runs and after all the death that had happened there. This is all that was left. Now, here's the only sad thing that I have to say about the German general. He had been beat, and he knew he was beat, but he was not going to commit suicide until Hitler promoted him to field marshal. The reason he promoted him to field marshal is because no Nazi had ever given up as a field marshal, and no field marshal had ever been taken alive. Hitler thought that he was condemning him to suicide or to fight to the very last man, which was the last transmission from the Nazis, which was you will fight till every last man in every last hole is dead. Hitler was determined to get something out of this battle. He was not going to, but he was determined to try. Paulus then decided against Hitler for the first time. He decided to give up. Paulus gave up with 300,000 Nazis. And out of that 300,000, only 91 went prisoners. 91,000 went prisoners. And out of that 91,000, only 6,000 made it home. Half of them died on the way because of the Russian winter that they had already been suffering through. But the other few thousand that made it out of the city did so on the planes from the runway that they had created. And the runway that they had created, it would start with a full plane packed with all these cargo. It would let it out, and then about 100, or not 100, but like all the soldiers that they could fit in there would go in there. On the last plane out, Paulus sent his wedding ring, along with a one-line note that said, "I'm sorry, honey, I'm never going to see you again." He sent it out on the last plane, along with some of his best soldiers, who were on the inside. What the Germans were doing, they were so desperate to get out of the city, so desperate. There is a record of Russian soldiers who are just sitting by the fire, not doing anything, and then start to hear thuds on their roofs. And it was of German soldiers, not committing suicide. The Germans were so determined to get out of the city, they held onto the wings of planes, trying to leave. They held onto the wings of the airplanes with everything they had, just trying to get out alive. A German pilot who went there said this. He said, "I had to try and take off of the runway, but there were so many people on my wings, I could only get so high in the air before I had to shake the plane to get them off." Now, that was the record of when they all started to thud. But the Russians had won. And in their victory, they destroyed the rest of the city. They took out all the there was nothing there's no salvageable buildings here. So they just destroyed the rest of the city and rebuilt it from scratch. At the end of the war, a crate of Nazi gold was found somewhere in Russia. They used all the Nazi gold to rebuild the city. Rebuilding the city, they wanted to forget all the horrible things that happened in the 7 months of fighting. So they renamed it Volgograd. And it's very hard to find maps of Stalingrad because after the battle they burned them all. They did not want people to remember this horrible battle that had taken place. But I don't want anybody here to forget it, because it single-handedly gave hope to the Allies that the Germans, they could be beat in large numbers. Even at the cost of 1 million lives at the end of the battle. 1 million from both sides. 49% of the Russians, 49%, and the 2% that was left over were Italians that tried to run away. The Russians are going to let that happen. But I want to inform you of how rats and Russian ingenuity helped save the world for the better, even if that was the last time it would ever happen. Thank you.
All right.